Welcome to Film Fam, inspired by true events. I'm Heather.
I'm Brian.
And I'm Zoe.
We're the Greys, and we're your Film Fam. For today's companion minisode to our Frankenstein episode, we are so excited to be talking to horror writer, playwright, scholar, audio drama producer, Jamieson Ridenhour. Welcome to the podcast, Jamieson.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
So you're our horror expert. You've written, novels, plays, short films, nonfiction. You write and produce an audio drama. You teach literature and writing, and you have a PhD in Victorian Gothic fiction. So we
Super
are
perfect, basically.
So excited. So perfect.
Thanks.
And so excited to talk to you about horror and Frankenstein today.
Cool. I sound so much cooler than I am when you say it all together like that. It's kind of fun.
Kind of a show off.
Yeah, I first met you when I was in your creative writing class, and then
That's
years later, I was at a bookstore and I found a copy of Carmilla that had
really?
your name on the front, and I'm like, am I the friend and erstwhile student of this version of Carmilla's author? And
yeah.
yes, I was.
Well, cool.
It's my claim to fame.
That makes me happy that was out in the world findable like that.
Jamieson, how did you get into horror?
Well, it's a pretty specific path, but I can tell you how it started. It started when I was 10 or 11. My parents got divorced. That's not the horror part. Although I did write a Frankenstein-themed poem about it later.
Oh my
gosh.
gosh.
For about a year and a half between my parents' divorce and my mother marrying my stepfather, it was just me and my two brothers who were younger than I was living with my mother. And my mother is a big horror fan, or she's a big fan of Gothic, she doesn't like slasher films or anything, but she likes, Rebecca and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And for that year and a half, and I was 11 to almost 12, every Friday night in Florence, South Carolina, where I lived, there was a horror movie double feature. There was some grandpa guy dressed up like a vampire who would introduce usually an episode of Darren McGavin's The Night Stalker, which is absolutely bad and in all the best ways. And then a black and white horror film, one of the Universal films, or Bela Lugosi, Boris Karloff, The Cat People, things like that. And it was it was a comfort thing. It was something me and my mother did together. My brothers had already gone to bed, and I got to sit up late because it would be 2 a.m. before they were done. And so that was cool, and I just fell in love with it. Then that became my thing. And also around the time I was 11, I checked the novel Dracula out of the public library in Florence and read it and didn't understand most of it, but loved it. Yeah.
So this guy who had this show on, it's kind of like the character in what's that movie with the vampire and the kids and they go
Fright Night.
Fright Night.
Yeah, but he was not that cool at all. This was I don't actually remember. I wish I could remember his name, what he called himself. It was sort of, the local TV host doing this kind of thing, dressing up like horror characters, was like a tradition going back to the 50s. It's Elvira, Mistress of the Dark, and all that kind of stuff.
Oh, we still watch Svengoolie.
Yeah, exactly. Well, this was a poor man's Svengoolie. So it was just some schmo that worked at the local radio, the TV station in Florence, South Carolina, who they schnookered into putting on a Dracula costume every Friday night.
No joke, that is all I aspire to be.
Right? What a gig! What a great gig!
I know. I'm like, I would love to be that schmo.
Yeah. So yeah, that was but that's how it started. And then after that, I was lucky enough to come of age during the second big horror wave. The first horror wave in the late 60s and 70s with Rosemary's Baby and The Exorcist. And then when I was in high school, I started high school in 1983. So I was reading Stephen King novels as they came out. That was during his most prolific period. So I was reading Pet Sematary and when Christine came out, I went and bought it at the bookstore the week it came out. And I just read King, and from King I read Peter Straub, who's still my favorite horror author. And I got Stephen King's Dance Macabre right when I started college. And in the back of that, he's got, here are the 100 best horror movies. Here are the 100 best horror novels. And so
Oh.
for like 2 or 3 years in college, I used that as my, like, I'm going to take King's list and read Ramsey Campbell. And, all the 80s was a great horror decade.
I'll look and see if I can find that list. That would be an interesting thing to link to for this episode because
Yeah,
I'm
I
interested in seeing that
100%
list.
want to do that. I want to be that college
Sure.
kid going through Stephen King's list.
Yeah, I mean it's really circumscribed. Like Dance Macabre is a nonfiction history of horror from 1950 to 1980, so it's really like a only within this time period. So it doesn't include, like, I don't even think Friday the 13th is on it because it's comes just up
Right.
to that era and stops. But there's all these like gems of things that I would never have discovered on my own that weren't really in the popular consciousness that King felt like we should read. And I did what he told me back then. So
It's so funny talking about Stephen King because, like, my mom was a huge Stephen King aficionado when she was a kid, and so then I was when I was a kid because we had him on all the bookshelves. But I just had the weird experience of, like, growing up with it, knowing that my mom grew up with it, who's of y'all's generation, and then I just, like, a month or two ago got the most recent book he released and read it here at college. Like, it's weird to have like an author that's so important to my childhood and my parents' childhood that's like still cranking them out like right now, and I'm reading them in real time. It's
yeah,
it's
he
cool.
doesn't stop. He doesn't stop. Yeah.
Speaking of, do you consider the movie of Frankenstein a horror movie?
Yeah, it was. They didn't use the term in the 30s like we use it as a genre of, like, you could find a horror section in Barnes and Noble. They wouldn't have said that. I mean, they would have used terms like it was a thriller. The great book on this era is by David Skal. It's called The Monster Show. And it's really good. And he would know exactly what the phrases they used for it. They would have said it was horrific or there was horror involved, but they wouldn't have called it horror film, horror movie. Partially because these were the first movies that did this. They call them monster movies a lot. But there wasn't a genre. It wasn't like, oh, here's another horror film, or this is a film that does what these other things have done. It was like, holy crap, we've never seen anything like Frankenstein on film before. So it was, even though the book was an established thing, obviously.
And then the book at its time was inventing or a first foray into something.
Yeah, the book is, I think I said this in my email back to Heather when we were talking about it, that I'm strongly the opinion that Frankenstein's not a Gothic novel. It's a science fiction novel. Because I define Gothic, and a lot of, I am not the only scholar to do this, but I define Gothic as being about fear of the past coming back to haunt you in some way. And that could be your personal past. It could be the past of the region or area around you. It can be the primitive or primeval past. Jekyll and Hyde does that to a degree where you're like de-evolving back into apishness. But it's something about the past haunting us and refusing to stay dead. Frankenstein is a mad scientist novel, and it's about reaching for knowledge beyond what we're supposed to be able to do. And so I class it with like Island of Dr. Moreau or other novels, which are really more about fear of the future or fear of what man is capable of doing. Nobody ever thinks that or agrees with me, so I only get to say it on places like this. Peter Straub says that horror isn't a genre, it's a mode. And that any form of writing in any genre can drop into horror at any time. You can have horror moments in other, because there's moments of horror in Over the Garden Wall.
Oh yeah.
Right?
Oh yeah.
But I wouldn't say this is a horror cartoon. I subscribe to Shudder. Are you guys on Shudder?
I don't have
I
Shudder.
don't think so, no.
It's the horror like Amazon
Yeah, it's like Netflix
streaming
for horror.
service. Yeah.
And I get really irritated at the user comments because they have reviews on each movie. And they have a really wide range of things. They have some really crappy things. They have some like classic giallo films. They have new stuff they do. But invariably, no matter what it is, there'll be somebody underneath that gives it like a 1-star review and says, well, it's a fine movie, but it's not horror. Because they've got this narrow definition of, there wasn't, the quantity of blood wasn't big enough, or I didn't see, or whatever.
Wait a second, Jamieson. You're saying that you read comments sometimes and you find them annoying?
I do. It's weird. It's weird. No, it's a weird genre. I mean, people think weird things about it, and they think weird things about those of us who make it. So you hear that too.
I mean, that's why I think Mary Shelley is so fantastic, because I think men a little bit get more of a leeway to love horror than when women do. We raise a little bit more eyebrows, or like, what does that mean about you if you love horror or you write horror? And Mary Shelley's just such a good role model for that to be allowed.
Yeah. Did you guys talk about the whole opium party in Geneva that caused Frankenstein on your other? Okay, good.
Yeah, we did.
Good, cool.
Super fun times.
Yeah,
for
good
the
times.
men who were there.
Yeah, we started that story in 536 and then worked our way toward that.
Yeah.
Brian talked about the fact that there was a volcano that happened, and the summer without
The Year Without a
sun,
Summer,
or the year without summer.
Yeah.
Right.
1816.
I actually want to ask you about that because I did some of the research on the Villa Diodati and all of that. And what I have found myself so curious about is the figure of John Polidori, because he comes across as such a dark horse. I feel like I want to write a thesis on him.
There's
because
a lot to be said about him. Yeah. I just started teaching Dracula in my Victorian Lit class this morning, and we did a whole thing on John Polidori because it's the origin of Dracula as well. I mean, we get Dracula and Frankenstein from that party. We didn't get anything from Percy Shelley. Did you guys discover why Percy Shelley did not participate in the ghost story competition?
No, I would love to know why.
He took too much opium, and he had visions of a woman approaching him who had eyes instead of nipples, and he was terrified. And he locked himself in his room and refused to come out. So Percy Shelley was cowering in his bed. Isn't that amazing? That's my favorite part of the story.
Yeah, and that's the next, universal monster character that we need to be exploring.
Right.
It's
Is
Dracula,
creature with eyes
Frankenstein, and
nipple eyes.
eyeball
nipple eye woman. Yeah. Yeah, that's a lot of opium, man. So Polidori, I don't know how much of this you already know. I mean, Polidori was Byron's personal physician and probably his lover. And so Byron, they were in Switzerland because they had fled England because a scandal had broken that Byron had been accused of sleeping with his sister, which is almost certainly true. And he was his half-sister, and he had a daughter with her. So he left. And Byron is just the original, bad boy of rock and roll, of poetry. He was a horrible person. So they go down there. Polidori goes with him, and whether or not they actually had an affair, Polidori was definitely in love with Byron.
That's the sense I get.
Yeah. So a few weeks after they get there, Claire Claremont shows up. Claire Claremont is a cousin of the Shelleys, and she's likely pregnant with Byron's child, as it appears to be half the women in England were. But she shows up like pining for Byron, and also just like, you need to take care of my child. And Byron begins to pay attention to her and ignore Polidori. And knowing Byron, he likely played the drama here. So Polidori felt shunned. He felt cast off. He challenged Byron to a duel over this woman. And Byron did what's the most shameful thing you can do to someone who challenges you to a duel. He laughed at him and sent him away. Instead of actually doing the duel, he laughed and sent him off. So Polidori goes back to England and writes The Vampire, which was published in 1819, which includes a character who is Lord Byron. He's called Lord Ruthven, and he is a womanizer and a seducer and a vampire, and it is a massive hit. And from that point on, and not before that, the figure of the vampire as a cold, aloof, aristocratic figure becomes a theme that you see woven through the vampire stories in the rest of the 19th century. So by the time it gets to Bram Stoker, what, 70 years later, it's just a trope. It's like, obviously the vampire's account, because that's what we started with. But yeah, it's all because Lord Byron was a dick to John Polidori, and so he wrote a
hot dick.
a hot dick, and so that, like, the figure of the vampire that we have, that aristocratic vampire, is really just it's bitchy ex-boyfriend fan fiction that Polidori wrote.
And it's so funny because like Byron and Percy Shelley are like such big names, but really, like, they did not, like, the things that came out of that trip, that vacation, were not by them, but inspired by just how shitty, like, they're just such shitty men.
Yeah,
and,
exactly.
Like, Mary Shelley and John Polidori were like, I'm gonna write a story about feeling unloved by these shitty famous poet men.
Yeah.
And those stories became famous, and yet, like, I don't think most of the people that I know who John Polidori is, but they know Lord Byron.
And weirdly, the works become more famous. Like, most people don't know who John Polidori is, but most people couldn't name 5 works by Byron.
Right.
You know, we know who Byron is because he was such a larger-than-life figure, but have people read Harold's Pilgrimage or Don Juan? No. I did, so you don't have to.
Well, right. That's like Byron and Shelley, people know their names, but way more people are familiar with the story of a vampire and Frankenstein.
Or Frankenstein, yeah, exactly. So
Right,
Mary
and
Shelley.
what that, like, became afterwards. Like, yeah, in the public
Yeah,
consciousness.
they just didn't die. They just kept going and kept going. Carmilla is my favorite vampire story, and I feel like she drew heavily on Polidori.
Yeah, Carmilla's so
Yeah.
good. I could talk so much more about Lord Byron. I want to recommend a play that I was in just last semester called Arcadia by Tom Stoppard that has fictionalized kind of story about Byron. To all you podcast listeners, it's a good show. You should go read it.
Yeah, and there's more. I mean, we can say he inspired the vampire, but the Byronic hero, which is what that character is called, that Byron used in all of his works, is in everything. I mean, it's I am an aloof, damaged, brooding, dark-haired man who I'm hot, but I've got a secret, and that secret can probably be solved by the love of a good woman if I'll let her close. I mean, that's a trope you recognize, right?
Right.
It's every Bronte sisters main character. It's even like it's John Wayne, it's Clint Eastwood. It's a figure that we see again and again and again. The sort of brooding, broken anti-hero. That's Byron. I mean, we have him to thank for or blame for all of that.
Both.
He was a fascinating
I'll
guy.
thank him and blame him.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a character archetype that I love, but it also just makes me think about how, like, those, like, his legacy is canonized, and we do think about, like, Frankenstein's monster, like, that is a trope, but when we think of it, we don't call it, like, the Mary Shelley-esque
Right.
abandoned intelligence.
Yeah.
I think that the creature is the most compelling character in Frankenstein.
He's
sure.
absolutely sympathetic. Yeah. He's not monstrous. He's presented as monstrous in various parts of the book, but he's definitely to be sympathized with.
Yeah, I mean, that's mostly what we talked about when we were talking about about Mary Shelley is less about the science fiction, because I feel like it is about, like, what we could do in the future. But, you know, she doesn't really get into any kind of, like, how it was made.
Yeah.
So I talked more about just the grief and the loss and the monstrousness of all of these various things that happened to her in her life, and how, you know, just how we saw that in the monster.
It's true. They don't go into the mechanism.
I mean, it's
but
galvanism
she-
somehow.
Yeah.
Right,
She
right.
clearly gives the impression that it was thought out, planned, organized, experimented, followed the scientific method. And, you know, it was kind of the first book to put all of those pieces together and say that the plot is now driven by somebody who went down this path and did this purposefully.
Yeah.
About the movie, are you a fan?
Yeah, I think Bride is better.
Yeah,
Br-
I agree.
I feel that.
But I am a fan. James Whale is a fantastic, I started to say character, but he really was a character. So yeah, I love him. Pretty openly gay in the 1930s in Hollywood.
Yeah.
That's pretty awesome. So it's a queer film in a lot of ways because
Right.
anything Whale made was. And I dig
I mean,
that.
that's how we read it when we were talking about the film. I kind of leaned hard into it as a queer film. And I think Bride of Frankenstein is more obvious, but I think Frankenstein is it can pretty clearly be read that way.
Yeah, I think so too.
And not just because he was gay, but I can see, the outsider, the persecuted, the come back and be a heteronormative person, Frankenstein, and all.
Right. And I'm
Yeah.
I'm being persecuted for something that's not my fault. I literally was made this way, and I'm trying to do
Right.
my
Yeah.
best and trying to be good, and society won't let me do that. No, absolutely, it works that way. And I guess it's more obvious in Bride because you've got the incredible Dr. Pretorius, played by what's his name? I can't
Yeah.
remember his name, but I love that
We
actor.
talked about him last time, right? Who's also a gay actor or bisexual?
Yeah,
Yeah.
he was a bisexual actor and just apparently like very flamboyant, even for like openly. And because Whale was like it was like an open secret that he was gay, but it wasn't it wasn't safe to like just gay at everybody while you walked around the streets. But what's his name? I can't remember his name.
Ernest Thesiger?
Ernest Thesiger. Yeah, he's
Thesiger,
also in
yeah.
a there's a movie that Whale made between those two movies called The Old Dark House that I
Oh,
just
my
watched.
parents watched that just recently. Yeah.
Well, he's in that too. He's the brother, the afraid brother. But my favorite thing about Ernest Thesiger is that apparently he did cross stitch. That was his thing.
Oh.
And on set, he always had stuff there, and he referred to himself as the stitchin' bitch. And
Love
and he would apparently just burst into a room. The stitchin' bitch is here. Let's get started. And I adore him. I think he's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, his character is so, like, archly queer.
Yeah.
It's pretty wonderful. Okay, well, what is your favorite classic horror film?
Creature from the Black Lagoon.
Oh,
Very
that's
nice.
great. There's a
Yeah.
book that just came out called something like The Lady
The
from
lady
the
from the Black Lagoon, about the woman that designed the costume. Yeah.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's something I'll have to get into at some point.
I've heard it's really good. She apparently, I can't remember her name. She apparently was like a really prominent makeup artist and special effects artist in the 40s and 50s. One of the only women to do it at that time.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, what's your favorite slasher flick?
Classic slasher or resurgent slasher?
70s, 80s.
Okay. I will give the caveat that I have a play opening in October called Bloodbath that is a slasher play, stage play.
Oh my gosh.
And it was supposed to open last October, but it got COVIDed into this year.
Oh.
So we're actually having a read through next weekend to start it up again. So in preparation, or while I was writing that play in 2019, early 2020, I watched something like 45 slasher films back to back. Like I was watching a slasher film a night. But my favorite one is what I would consider the first slasher film, which is the 1974 Canadian Black Christmas
Black Christmas.
Yes.
Yeah.
with Olivia Hussey. It's
A
so good.
terrifying movie, even by
It's
today's standards.
Ri-
The
right?
phone calls, so
The phone calls are
scary.
scary. Yeah,
Yeah.
And you got Margot Kidder being absolutely amazing. You've got Olivia Hussey, who is just gorgeous and perfect, and her acting is just on point. You've got John Saxon in the first of his many roles as as the cop in a
yeah.
horror film.
I'm interested in knowing more about the slasher play that you're making. I'm working on a slasher play right now, actually,
Oh,
quite
I would love to
coincidentally, and I
see it.
didn't know that was a big genre. So
I
I'm
don't think
super
it
interested in
is.
seeing yours.
One of the things I like to do as a playwright is try and do things that haven't been done on stage before. And so because I'm a horror movie fan, I really feel like it ought to be possible to do the things that happen in horror films, the tropes and even like methods of making people scared. I feel like you ought to be able to pull that off in live theater, and I've rarely seen it done well. I have occasionally seen it done well. I saw A Woman in Black at the West End in London, and it scared the crap out of me. But often it's not, and so my play Grave Lullaby was a kind of a classic M.R. James style ghost story. I've done I did an immersive zombie play that was where basically the zombie apocalypse happens outside the theater you're sitting in. It was a one act. And just trying to, is
That
it
sounds
possible to
awesome.
do it? So things like the classic slasher move. I think this first happened in Halloween, the original Halloween, where like you're panning across, and as you pan across, the killer sits up or something happens, and it kind of passes by in the background. And so I'm really fascinated by the way the camera shows us what it wants us to see, and in theater you don't have any control over that, because audiences can watch anything they want wherever they want. And so I take it as a challenge to like, can I do that kind of sleight of hand? Can I force the audience to watch something on this side of the stage while I set up something they don't see coming over here? And I
Right, you
love
can't
that
do
kind
a
of shit.
close-up
No, you
on
can't.
somebody that doesn't show who's behind them, and
Right.
then it pulls out to show
Right.
who's behind them.
Right. So you've got to figure
Well-
out how you do that without controlling the audience.
I mean, that sounds like a great challenge. And I'm just thinking about in Halloween, there's the part where he sits up like the Undertaker, or the Undertaker sits up like him in
Yeah.
the future, but the Undertaker sit. But there's also when Laurie is going up the stairs at the house across the street, and he's actually
Silhouetted
in the
behind her
doorway.
Yeah, yeah.
and and then you see him, but she doesn't, and
Right.
you start to see it later. And I'm thinking how you could do a little magic over like everyone's looking at this, but then this guy's standing over here.
That's
That
what
would
I
be
would like
scary.
to do, this kind of things. And for the slasher play is it's called Bloodbath: Victoria's Secret. I wanted to call it Bloodbath and Beyond: Victoria's Secret,
So good.
but there's already a horror movie podcast out there called Bloodbath and Beyond. But I felt pretty proud of that when I came up with it. But anyhow, it's about a woman named Victoria Lee. Tori Piper is her stage name, and she was a scream queen in the late '80s, early '90s. She was the go-to final girl, and she's been in retirement for a while, but she's thinking about coming back.
Yeah, talk to us about your horror podcast or audio drama.
My audio drama is my favorite thing I have ever done. It is my favorite thing ever. It's called Palimpsest. And our tagline is, it's about memory, identity, and the things that haunt us. It is mostly single-voiced, although there's usually at least one episode per season where we have other actors come in. But it's mainly a monologue. And each season is 10 episodes long, and it's a different story and character and really genre every season. And we're about to start we drop the first episode of season 4 on April 13th. So season 1 was a classic ghost story in the Peter Straub, M.R. James style, about a woman who's lost her sister about 10 years ago, and she's just gone through a breakup. She's living in an apartment by herself for the first time, and she's having a hard time letting go of her sister, and her sister might be having a hard time letting go of her. And season 2 is a queer fairy love story set in the 19th century.
Amazing.
A woman is hired. She runs away from a kind of abusive home life and gets hired as the maid servant to this tiny woman in a high-end freak show. And so she's hired to be her assistant, and very quickly sort of falls for the tiny woman whose name is Saoirse, and
Awesome.
and very quickly realizes that maybe the freaks in this freak show they're exhibited as being fairies, and maybe they're real. Like some of them are kind of scary, and some of them are different acting. And then Saoirse tells her, "I need you to help us escape." because we're being held here against our will. That's that story. And then season 3 was set during London in the Blitz, and it's a sort of cosmic horror / folk horror about an American code breaker who's been fired from her job as a code breaker and just is living in a boarding house in London and begins seeing the ghost of the London dead, first just the dead from the war, but then the dead throughout the history of London walking the streets, and they seem to be able to see her and want something from her. So that's what we've done so
That sounds
far.
awesome.
I'm
Yeah.
actually just
I definitely need to
thinking
hear that
now-
one.
I'm thinking now about your definition of what a Gothic is and what palimpsest means, which, you know, it's a, for our listeners, it's a piece of paper that had writing on it that was erased or covered up with now like new writing and material over top. You can still see the old stuff coming through. And I mean, I think if that's part of your, you know, like artist
Yeah.
statement about Gothic is like constantly being haunted by the past or unable to get rid of some
Yeah.
like scary parts of the past. I just kind of put that together.
Yeah,
and
the
I love
past
it.
the past shows through no matter how much you try and paint over it, no matter how much you try and rewrite it. The original thing always, there's traces that always show.
I love that.
That's why we called it that. Yeah. So we also have at least there's a moment in every season where I try to organically and not clunkily. The main character defines the word palimpsest or uses the word palimpsest in a way that new listeners can be like, you know, what the hell does your title mean? And it was just, it sounded clever. I felt very smart when we did it, and just like nobody can pronounce it, nobody can spell it, nobody knows what it means. It's like, you know, so I really shot myself in the foot.
Jamieson, I'm going to have to get some recommendations from you.
Okay.
Okay. So what if someone who's like, I don't really know, I might get too scared with horror movies. I don't know if I'd like horror movies, but I'm listening to this podcast and now I feel like I do want to watch a horror movie. What would you recommend to this person who I just made up?
I mean, I get asked that a lot. I get, it's the only genre where people will like go out of their way to insult the genre that you write in. Like I'm really like I'll be having a conversation on Facebook about the fact that I write horror, and somebody will say something, and then somebody like I don't even know will just show up on the thread and say, "Oh, I could never read anything that you write because I hate horror. I just wanted to show up and tell you that." I was like, "Thanks." People think that nobody's like, "Oh, I hate romance. I would never read your romance novel." But
Men
Actually,
do that.
maybe,
Men
yeah,
do that
I
sometimes.
guess that's true. I guess that's true. So I take it back. But I think I go back to for that recommendation for that fictional person. I go back to what I said earlier about horror not being a genre but being a mode, and so I think the honest answer to them is you probably already like something or know of something that has moments of horror in it. You just didn't think that's what it was because it wasn't labeled that or whatever. But there are all kinds of shows that have moments of horror in them. But I would say there's some, particularly we're in a resurgence. We're in a renaissance of good horror. So I would say Jordan Peele. Go to Jordan Peele. Go to Get
Yeah.
Out. Not Us, because Us is a little bit slashery in the middle. But I would do Get Out.
Yeah.
I would do Midsummer, which is just a beautiful fucking film. Oh my god. Probably the best horror movie of the last 10 years, I think, is It Follows.
I like
Oh,
that.
I
I liked
enjoyed
it.
that.
That was a controversial movie amongst the people that I knew. Like, I liked it. I thought it was really good. I know some people my age who were like, "That's such a stupid premise."
What you're punished? I mean, the premise is you're being punished for being promiscuous. It's the premise of like
Right.
every horror film of the 1980s. So I mean, it was,
Yeah.
but it's just so effectively done. And so one of my favorite things about horror is that it is self-referential.
Oh, very. Yeah, yeah.
And so for
Yeah.
people that are just getting into it, it's sometimes they miss what's going on because horror relies on you knowing the tropes, right? Horror, like
Yeah.
if you're going to have an exorcism film now, the assumption is you know about Linda Blair, you know about what that looks like, and we're going to be able to play with that. And sometimes that works against itself, I think.
Well, that makes me think of Scream, which is one of Zoe's favorite horror movies. But I started Zoe off. I was like, you're almost old enough to start watching horror movies. So let's start watching the old black and white horror movies to get you
Nosferatu.
ready.
Yeah.
So that you understand, so that you've seen, like you understand who Dracula is and Frankenstein and Nosferatu. Like, I want you to watch these first, and then we can start watching
That's very
the later
smart.
ones.
I love that. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Jameson, we could obviously talk forever
Yeah.
about horror movies with you because we love it, and it's great to talk to someone who also seems to love it. Well, tell us where we can find that book, the name of it, and where we can find it.
If you want to get something of mine, my edition, I edited a scholarly edition of Carmilla, that Zoe was talking about, and that's $12 from Valancourt Press. And
Yeah,
that's there.
Lesbian Vampire.
But you can also do palimpsest for free. And you can go to my website and see my films are on there for the most part. There's links to short fiction and poetry.
And what's your website?
Jamieson Ridenhour Writer.com.
Well, that was so wonderful, Jameson.
That was.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you for having me. This has been great.
Like Film Fam, inspired by true events, subscribe to hear more stories that inspired our favorite films.
For photos and links from the show and other shenanigans, follow us on Instagram at FilmFamPodcast, on Twitter at FilmFam_podcast, or on Facebook at FilmFam Inspired by True Events.
If you have any questions, comments, corrections, or films whose inspiration you'd like us to explore, you can email us at filmfampodcast@gmail.com.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Zoe. Thank you all for listening. See you next time.
Bye.